The screaming started at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. That should have been ordinary. Children's laughter cut short, replaced by the thunderous roar of helicopters and the sharp crack of tactical boots on playground asphalt. 8-year-old Ahmad Khalil dropped his small garden trowel and looked up in terror as black-clad figures surrounded him. Weapons drawn, shouting commands he couldn't understand over the chaos erupting around Maplewood Elementary's playground. What had begun as a simple school project burying a time capsule filled with drawings and letters to future students would become the most devastating afternoon in the quiet suburb's history. The call that shattered this peace came from Margaret Maggie Richardson, a 43-year-old insurance adjuster whose manicured fingers trembled as she pressed 911 on her phone while crouched behind her Honda CR-V. "There's a Middle Eastern child burying something suspicious at the elementary school playground," she whispered urgently into the phone, her voice quavering with what sounded like genuine fear. "I think he's planting explosives. You need to send someone immediately." The dispatch operator's voice remained calm and professional. "Ma'am, can you describe what you're seeing exactly?" Maggie's eyes narrowed as she watched Ahmad carefully placing his sealed mason jar into the small hole he'd dug near the oak tree. The boy's concentration was complete, his small hands working methodically as other children played on the swings nearby. "He's got some kind of container. Metal, I think. And he keeps looking around like he doesn't want anyone to see. This is exactly how they do it on the news. Please, you have to hurry." 23 minutes earlier, Ahmad had been sitting in Mrs. Patterson's third-grade classroom, carefully sealing his time capsule contributions. Inside the jar were his drawings of his family's journey from Syria, a letter written in both Arabic and English describing his hopes for America, and a small toy car his father had given him, the only possession that survived their escape from Aleppo. The assignment was simple: bury something meaningful that future students might find and learn from. Ahmad had chosen the spot by the oak tree because it reminded him of the olive grove behind his grandmother's house, the one destroyed in the bombing 3 years ago. Mrs. Patterson had smiled when Ahmad asked if he could bury his time capsule during recess. "Of course, sweetie. Just remember to mark the spot so we can find it for the ceremony next month." She'd handed him a small flag to place beside the tree, unaware that this innocent gesture would soon be misinterpreted as something sinister. The SWAT response was swift and overwhelming. Within 18 minutes of Maggie's call, 2 helicopters circled overhead while tactical teams converged on the playground from 3 directions. Children screamed and scattered as officers in full combat gear shouted orders. Parents who had come early for pickup were pushed behind police barriers, many crying and demanding to know what was happening to their children. Ahmad's teacher, Sarah Patterson, had been monitoring recess from the playground's edge when the chaos began. She watched in horror as her student, a gentle boy who helped other children with their English and always offered to clean the classroom erasers, was forced to the ground by officers who couldn't have known that his trembling came not from guilt, but from traumatic memories of soldiers in his homeland. "Stop," she screamed, running toward the tactical team. "He's just a child. He's doing a school project." But her voice was lost in the mechanical thunder of helicopters and the barked commands of the response team. Ahmad's mother, Fatima Khalil, was folding laundry in their small apartment 6 blocks away when her neighbor burst through the front door without knocking. "Turn on the news," Nadia gasped, her face pale. "Something's happening at the school." Fatima's blood turned to ice as she saw the aerial footage on Channel 7 News. The playground where her son spent his happiest hours in America was now a military zone. She grabbed her hijab and ran, her heart pounding with the same terror she'd felt during the bombing raids in Syria. The distance to the school had never felt so far. Each step weighted with the horrible certainty that history was repeating itself in the one place she'd thought her family would finally be safe. The bomb squad arrived 45 minutes after Maggie's initial call. Sergeant Mike Torres, a 20-year veteran of the force, approached Ahmad's small burial site with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through hundreds of similar calls. He'd seen real explosive devices, had disarmed pipe bombs and pressure cooker devices, had felt the sick weight of genuine terror. What he found beneath the oak tree made him pause and remove his helmet, his weathered face creasing with something between relief and profound sadness. The mason jar contained no explosives, no detonators, no weapons of any kind. Instead, Torres lifted out carefully preserved children's artwork, a handwritten letter in 2 languages, and a small red toy car with one wheel slightly bent. He held up the contents for his team to see, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent playground through his radio. "All clear. No explosive device. Repeat. No explosive device found." But the damage was already done. 37 children had witnessed the terrifying response, many now crying in their parents' arms behind the police barriers. Ahmad remained in custody, confused and scared, while his mother fought desperately to reach him. The local news crews, alerted by police scanners, had arrived in time to broadcast the tactical response live, but missed the gentle revelation of the time capsule's innocent contents. Maggie Richardson watched from her car as the scene began to wind down, her hands still shaking as she realized the magnitude of what she'd set in motion. Part of her felt vindicated. She'd seen something suspicious and reported it, exactly as the post-9/11 security campaigns had urged citizens to do. But another part of her, a quieter voice she'd been suppressing for months, whispered that she'd let her fears transform a child's school project into a community trauma. The Khalil family had moved to Maplewood 6 months earlier, part of the Syrian refugee resettlement program that had divided the town's residents into 2 camps. One group, led by Pastor David Chen of the Interfaith Community Center, had organized welcome committees and English tutoring. The other, smaller but more vocal group, had attended town hall meetings expressing concerns about security risks and cultural integration challenges. Maggie had attended 3 of those meetings, sitting in the back row and nodding when speakers talked about the need to stay vigilant and protect our children. She'd never spoken up, never voiced her fears directly, but they'd been growing stronger each time she saw Ahmad and his family at the grocery store or walking to school. The boy's dark hair and his mother's hijab triggered something in her that she couldn't quite name, a mixture of anxiety and resentment that had been building since her divorce, since her job cutbacks, since her own sense of security had begun to crumble. Principal Janet Morrison arrived at the playground just as the tactical teams were beginning to withdraw. She'd spent 14 years in education, had managed everything from natural disasters to active shooter drills, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of her playground transformed into a crime scene. Ahmad sat alone on a bench, still in handcuffs despite the all clear, his small shoulders shaking with silent tears. "Remove those handcuffs immediately," she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years managing both children and adults in crisis. "This child is 8 years old and was doing a classroom assignment on my school grounds with my permission." The arresting officer, Detective Ray Martinez, looked uncomfortable as he unlocked the cuffs. He'd been a cop for 12 years, had 2 kids of his own at Maplewood Elementary, and the whole situation felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. "We had to follow protocol, ma'am." The caller was very specific about the threat level. "The caller was wrong," Morrison said flatly, kneeling beside Ahmad and speaking to him in the gentle tone she used with frightened children. "Ahmad, sweetheart, you're safe now. We're going to find your mama. Okay." Ahmad looked up at her, with eyes that seemed far older than his 8 years. "I was burying my pictures," he whispered in accented English, "for the future children to find. Did I do something bad?" Morrison felt her heart break a little more. "No, baby, you didn't do anything bad at all. Sometimes adults get scared and make mistakes. Big, terrible mistakes." The investigation into the false report began immediately, led by Detective Sarah Patel of the Suburban Police Department's Community Relations Division. Patel, herself a second-generation immigrant, whose parents had faced similar suspicions when they'd arrived from India in the 1980s, approached the case with both professional thoroughness and personal understanding of its implications. The playground security cameras, installed 3 years earlier after a series of vandalism incidents, had captured everything. The footage showed Ahmad arriving with his small gardening tools and mason jar, carefully selecting his spot, and methodically burying his time capsule while other children played nearby. At no point did his behavior appear secretive or threatening. He'd even waved to Mrs. Patterson when she'd glanced over from her playground supervision post. More damning was the timestamp evidence showing that Maggie Richardson had been parked across from the playground for 47 minutes before making her 911 call. During that time, according to the footage, she'd made 3 separate phone calls on her cell phone and had taken numerous photographs of Ahmad and other children with her smartphone camera. When Detective Patel reviewed Maggie's phone records and social media activity, a disturbing pattern emerged. Over the past 6 months, Maggie had made 17 complaints to various city departments about the Khalil family and other refugee families in the neighborhood. She'd reported suspicious gatherings that turned out to be children's birthday parties, called in possible health code violations for the smell of Middle Eastern cooking, and filed noise complaints about evening prayers that were barely audible beyond the family's own apartments. The most troubling discovery came when Patel accessed Maggie's Facebook activity, hidden behind privacy settings that she apparently thought made her posts invisible to investigators. Maggie had shared dozens of anti-immigrant memes and conspiracy theories. Her comment history revealed increasingly radical views about Muslim refugees, including posts supporting the idea that Syrian children were being trained as sleeper agents, and that refugee resettlement was part of a deliberate invasion strategy. 3 days after the playground incident, Patel sat across from Maggie in Interview Room B of the Maplewood Police Station. The space was deliberately non-threatening beige walls, comfortable chairs, a small table with tissues and water bottles, but Maggie's hands still trembled as she attempted to defend her actions. "I saw what I saw," Maggie insisted, her voice higher than usual. "A Middle Eastern child burying something suspicious. In this climate, with everything that's happened, I did what any responsible citizen would do. I reported a potential threat." Detective Patel slid a printed screenshot across the table. It showed one of Maggie's recent Facebook posts, shared just 2 days before the incident, a grainy meme claiming that refugee children were being used to scout targets for future attacks. "Mrs. Richardson, can you explain why you shared this image on your social media?" Maggie's face flushed red. That's not... I share lots of things. It doesn't mean I believe everything I see online." "But you called 911 and specifically mentioned that Ahmad Khalil was Middle Eastern." Patel continued calmly. "You couldn't have known his nationality or religion just from observing him at the playground. What made you identify him that way?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was finally being exposed. Maggie's mouth opened and closed several times before she found words. "I've seen him around the neighborhood with his mother. She wears that head covering. It was obvious." "So you called 911, not because of anything threatening you observed Ahmad doing, but because of assumptions you made about his background," Patel's voice remained professional, but her pen pressed harder against her notepad. Maggie stood abruptly, knocking over her water bottle. "I want a lawyer. I don't have to sit here and be interrogated for trying to protect my community." But the damage was already spreading beyond the confines of Interview Room B. News of the incident had reached regional media outlets, and by the weekend, Maplewood found itself at the center of a national conversation about xenophobia, false reports, and the traumatization of refugee children. The story gained particular traction when cell phone footage emerged, showing Ahmad being handcuffed, while other children screamed in terror in the background. The video had been recorded by Jennifer Walsh, a mother of two, who'd arrived early for pickup and witnessed the entire incident from behind the police barriers. She'd initially hesitated to share the footage, worried about privacy concerns and her children's faces being visible in the frame. But watching the news coverage that painted the SWAT response as a measured reaction to a credible threat, she realized that without the visual evidence, the true scope of the trauma might never be acknowledged. "People need to see what really happened," she told her husband that evening as they sat in their kitchen, her phone screen showing the video that had already been shared thousands of times. "They need to see that little boy's face when those officers surrounded him. They need to see what fear looks like when it's weaponized against children." The video went viral overnight, shared across social media platforms with hashtags like Maplewood Scandaland, Protect Refugee Children. It caught the attention of civil rights organizations, refugee advocacy groups, and, eventually, major news networks. By Monday morning, satellite trucks lined the streets around Maplewood Elementary, and reporters were interviewing anyone willing to speak about the incident. Ahmad hadn't returned to school since Tuesday. His mother, Fatima, kept him home not because of any physical injuries, but because he'd begun having nightmares and refused to play outside their apartment. The sound of helicopters common in their urban area sent him into panic attacks that reminded Fatima too painfully of their trauma in Syria. She'd brought her family to America to escape exactly this kind of fear, and now it had followed them into what should have been their safe haven. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, volunteered her services to the Khalil family through the Interfaith Community Center. When she met with Ahmad for the first time, she found a boy whose trust in the world had been fundamentally shaken. The playground was his favorite place, she explained to Fatima during their parent consultation. He associated it with freedom, with being accepted by other American children, with the possibility of belonging here. Now that same space represents danger and rejection. We're looking at complex trauma layered on top of his existing refugee experiences. The community response was swift, but divided. Pastor David Chen organized a solidarity rally outside City Hall, drawing over 300 supporters who carried signs reading, "We stand with Ahmad," and "Maplewood means welcome." Counter-protesters, roughly 24 in number, gathered across the street with their own signs claiming "Safety first" and "Trust but verify." The divide ran deeper than simple disagreement about the incident. It exposed fault lines that had been developing in Maplewood for months as the town struggled to absorb its new refugee residents. Property values, school overcrowding, cultural differences, and economic anxieties had created an environment where fear could flourish, even among people who would never have considered themselves prejudiced. At the town hall meeting called to address the incident, these tensions exploded into the open. Mayor Patricia Liu attempted to maintain order as residents lined up to express their views, but the evening quickly devolved into shouting matches and accusatory confrontations. "This could have been prevented if we'd had better vetting processes," declared Robert Hayes, a retired military officer who'd become an unofficial leader of the anti-refugee faction. "We're asking our citizens to be vigilant, and then We prosecute them when they report suspicious activity. What kind of message does that send? From the other side of the packed auditorium, Sarah Patterson rose to respond, her teacher's voice cutting through the crowd noise. Ahmad Khalil is one of the brightest, kindest students I've taught in 15 years. He helps other children with their homework. He translates for his mother at parent conferences. And he was doing exactly what I assigned him to do. The only thing suspicious about this situation is how quickly we turned a child's school project into a terrorism investigation. The applause that followed Mrs. Patterson's statement was loud, but not universal. Several attendees sat with arms crossed, their silence speaking as loudly as any words. The room's tension was palpable, thick with competing fears and resentments that ran much deeper than the playground incident itself. Mayor Liu called for order with her gavel, her face drawn with the stress of managing a crisis that had escalated far beyond her small-town experience. I want to remind everyone that we're here to discuss facts and find solutions, not to relitigate immigration policy or national security measures. But the facts, as they continued to emerge through Detective Patel's investigation, painted an increasingly clear picture of systematic harassment disguised as community concern. The 17 complaints Maggie had filed weren't isolated incidents of civic vigilance. They were part of a coordinated campaign to make life uncomfortable for refugee families in the hope they would choose to relocate elsewhere. The breakthrough in understanding Maggie's motivations came from an unexpected source, her own sister, Linda Richardson Morgan, who drove up from Denver after seeing the news coverage. Linda hadn't spoken to Maggie in 2 years, not since their mother's funeral when Maggie had made racist comments about the immigrant staff at the funeral home. But watching her sister's face on the news, seeing the hatred that had replaced the person she'd grown up with, Linda felt compelled to act. Maggie wasn't always like this, she told Detective Patel during a voluntary interview. She used to volunteer at the food bank, helped organize neighborhood block parties, taught Sunday school for years. But after her divorce, after she lost her promotion at the insurance company, something changed. She started finding reasons to blame other people for her problems. Linda pulled out her phone and showed Patel text messages from the past year rants about immigrants taking jobs, about refugees getting government benefits while real Americans struggled, about the changing demographics of their childhood neighborhood. The messages revealed a progression from general resentment to specific targeting that culminated in the playground incident. She joined these online groups? Linda continued, her voice thick with regret. Started spending hours a day reading conspiracy theories and hate speech. I tried to talk to her, but she said I didn't understand what was really happening in America. I should have tried harder. Maybe if I'd reported her posts, gotten her some help. The legal consequences for Maggie began to mount as the investigation concluded. The district attorney, Maria Santos, announced that Maggie would be charged with filing a false police report, a felony that carried potential jail time and hefty fines. But the charges went beyond the immediate incident. Prosecutors were also pursuing civil rights violations and exploring federal hate crime enhancements that could significantly increase the penalties. When someone uses emergency services as a weapon against an innocent child because of that child's perceived ethnicity or religion, it's not just a false report. Santos explained at a press conference. It's a deliberate attempt to intimidate and terrorize a family based on their background. That crosses the line from poor judgment into criminal civil rights violations. The financial costs of Maggie's call were staggering. The SWAT response, helicopter deployment, bomb squad investigation, and related police overtime had cost the city over $185,000. The school district was facing potential lawsuits from traumatized families and had already spent thousands on counseling services for affected children. Ahmad's family, through their pro bono legal team, was preparing a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking damages for the emotional trauma inflicted on their child. But the deepest costs weren't measured in dollars. Ahmad still hadn't returned to school 3 weeks after the incident, and Dr. Rodriguez reported that his recovery would require months of specialized therapy. Other refugee children in the district were showing signs of increased anxiety, and several families had inquired about transferring to different school systems where they might feel safer. The midpoint twist in the unfolding drama came when Detective Patel discovered that Maggie's harassment campaign hadn't been entirely solitary. Phone records revealed extensive communication with Marcus Webb, a regional organizer for a national anti-immigration group called Citizens for American Security. Webb had been coaching Maggie on how to file complaints that would be taken seriously by authorities, providing her with talking points and legal strategies designed to make refugees feel unwelcome without crossing obvious legal boundaries. The goal wasn't necessarily to get anyone arrested. Webb explained during his own interview with federal investigators. It was to create an atmosphere where these people would self-deport, make them understand they weren't welcome, that they'd be watched constantly, that any behavior outside the norm would be reported and investigated. This revelation transformed the case from an individual act of prejudice into evidence of a broader conspiracy. Federal prosecutors began examining whether Webb and his organization could be charged with civil rights violations for their systematic campaign against refugee communities. The investigation expanded to other towns, where similar patterns of harassment had been reported, revealing a network of anti-immigrant activists working to undermine resettlement programs through coordinated intimidation. The discovery of this broader conspiracy galvanized Maplewood's refugee supporters in ways that the original incident alone might not have achieved. Pastor Chen organized interfaith prayer vigils. The teachers' union passed a resolution condemning harassment of immigrant students, and local businesses began displaying "All are welcome here" signs in their windows. Even some residents who'd initially sympathized with Maggie's concerns began to reconsider their positions. Tom Bradley, a retiree who'd attended the early town hall meetings expressing security worries, found himself uncomfortable with the organized nature of the harassment campaign. "I was concerned about background checks and making sure everyone was properly vetted," he told his neighbor Helen Morrison. But this wasn't about security. This was about trying to drive families out of town through fear and intimidation. That's not the kind of community I want to be part of. The climactic confrontation came at the next city council meeting, held in the high school auditorium to accommodate the expected crowds. More than 800 people packed the venue, with overflow watching on screens in the gymnasium. Media crews from major networks had stationed cameras throughout the space, and security was heavy following online threats from both sides of the increasingly polarized community. Ahmad's father, Rashid Khalil, had prepared a statement with the help of his English tutor from the Interfaith Community Center. He'd never spoken publicly since arriving in America, preferring to keep his family's trauma private and focus on building their new life quietly. But the assault on his son had pushed him past his comfort zone into reluctant advocacy. "My family came to America fleeing violence, hoping our children could grow up without fear." He read in carefully pronounced English, his accent thick with emotion. "We left everything we owned, everyone we loved, because we believed America was a place where children could be safe to dream and learn and play." My son Ahmad was burying pictures of our family's journey, letters about his hopes for the future, small treasures from our old home. He was trying to plant roots in American soil, to claim his place in this community's story. The auditorium was completely silent as Rashid continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. Instead, he learned that in America, his skin color and his mother's hijab make him dangerous in some people's eyes. He learned that soldiers might surround him for the crime of being Muslim while doing schoolwork. But he also learned that there are Americans who will stand up for what is right, who will defend children regardless of where they came from. When Rashid finished speaking, the applause was sustained and overwhelming. But it was interrupted by a commotion near the back of the auditorium as Maggie Richardson entered with her attorney. She looked smaller than she had in news photographs, her usual confidence replaced by the hunched posture of someone who'd become accustomed to hostile stares. Her lawyer, James Morrison, no relation to Principal Morrison despite the shared surname, had advised against attending the meeting. But Maggie had insisted, driven by a mixture of defiance and a growing awareness that she needed to face the consequences of her actions publicly. The community's response to her presence was immediate, and visceral boos, hisses, and calls for her to leave echoing through the packed auditorium. Mayor Liu gavelled for order and announced that Maggie would be given the opportunity to address the community if she chose to do so. The decision was controversial. Several council members had argued against giving her a platform, but Liu felt that transparency required allowing all stakeholders to speak. Maggie approached the podium slowly, her hands visibly shaking as she unfolded a handwritten statement. The auditorium fell silent again. 800 people waiting to hear what she might say to justify the trauma she'd inflicted on their community. "I want to apologize," she began, her voice barely audible despite the microphone. "I was wrong. I was scared and angry about things in my own life. And I let that fear turn into hatred directed at innocent people." Ahmad Khalil is a little boy who was doing a school assignment, and I called him a terrorist because of how he looked and what his family's religion is. The statement was more honest than many had expected, but the community's response was mixed. Some appreciated her acknowledgement of wrongdoing, while others felt that an apology couldn't undo the trauma she'd caused or address the systematic nature of her harassment campaign. Ahmad's mother, Fatima, had been sitting quietly in the front row with her son beside her, his first public appearance since the incident, when Maggie finished speaking and turned to leave the podium. Ahmad stood up suddenly and walked toward her, causing a stir of concern among the adults present. The 8-year-old stopped directly in front of Maggie and looked up at her with the serious expression that had become familiar to his teachers and classmates. "I forgive you," he said in clear English, his young voice carrying throughout the silent auditorium. "But you have to promise not to be scared of other kids like me anymore." Maggie knelt down to Ahmad's eye level, tears streaming down her face for the first time since the incident began. "I promise," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry I scared you. I'm sorry I made you think America didn't want you here." The image of that moment, a small refugee child offering forgiveness to the woman who'd traumatized him, became the defining symbol of the Maplewood incident. Photographers captured the exchange from multiple angles, and the pictures appeared on front pages across the country, representing both the darkest and brightest aspects of America's response to refugee resettlement. The legal resolution came 6 months later in the county courthouse. Maggie pled guilty to all charges in a negotiated agreement that would spare her jail time in exchange for a comprehensive rehabilitation program. She was sentenced to 500 hours of community service, to be performed at refugee resettlement organizations, where she would work directly with the families she'd targeted. She was also required to pay restitution, covering the costs of the emergency response and the trauma counseling for affected children. The federal charges against Marcus Webb and Citizens for American Security resulted in a broader settlement that included monitoring provisions and restrictions on their organizing activities in communities with refugee populations. The case established important legal precedents about the use of emergency services as weapons of harassment and the civil rights protections for refugee families. But the most meaningful resolution happened at Maplewood Elementary School during the long-delayed time capsule ceremony in early spring. The event had been expanded from a simple classroom activity into a community-wide celebration of diversity and resilience. Ahmad's original time capsule, carefully preserved as evidence during the investigation, was finally buried beneath the oak tree, where it had always been intended to rest. Principal Morrison announced that the playground would be officially renamed the Ahmad Khalil Friendship Garden, with new equipment and landscaping funded by donations from across the country. A plaque near the oak tree would commemorate not just Ahmad's experience, but all children who'd faced fear and discrimination while trying to find their place in American communities. Ahmad, now 9 years old and having returned to school after months of therapy, spoke briefly at the ceremony. His English had improved dramatically during his time working with Dr. Rodriguez, and his confidence had been slowly rebuilding through the support of his classmates and teachers. "I wanted future kids to know about my family's story," he said, standing beside the freshly planted memorial garden. "About how we came from far away and found friends here. My time capsule has pictures of Syria and pictures of America, because both places are part of who I am now. I hope the kids who find it someday will understand that being different isn't scary. It's what makes communities stronger." The ceremony concluded with children from all of Maplewood's elementary classes contributing their own items to additional time capsules, creating a collection that represented the full diversity of their community. Letters in Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin, and English were buried together beneath the oak tree, alongside drawings, photographs, and small treasures that told the story of a town learning to embrace its changing identity. As the crowd dispersed and children ran to play on the new equipment, Ahmad found himself standing beside the memorial plaque with his parents. The inscription, written in both English and Arabic, read, "In memory of childhood innocence lost and community courage found. May this garden grow as a reminder that fear divides while understanding unites." Maggie Richardson, fulfilling her community service requirement, was planting flowers along the garden's border under the supervision of Pastor Chen's volunteer coordinator. She'd lost her job at the insurance company and faced ongoing legal challenges. But she was slowly beginning the difficult work of understanding how her fears had been manipulated and channeled into hatred. Her therapy sessions with the same trauma counselor who'd worked with Ahmad were helping her recognize the warning signs of radicalization and develop healthier ways to process anxiety and loss. The Khalil family's civil rights lawsuit had been settled out of court, with damages that would ensure Ahmad's college education and provide ongoing support for his counseling needs. But more importantly, Fatima later reflected, the legal victory had established protections that might prevent other refugee children from experiencing similar trauma. 6 months after the ceremony, Ahmad was thriving in 4th grade, having formed close friendships with classmates who'd initially learned about him through the traumatic news coverage, but who now knew him as the kid who shared his lunch, helped with math homework, and told amazing stories about his family's adventures traveling from Syria to America. His nightmares had largely stopped, and he'd begun playing outside their apartment building again, though his mother still felt anxious when helicopters passed overhead. The Maplewood incident had become a case study in graduate programs for social work, criminology, and refugee resettlement. Dr. Rodriguez frequently spoke at conferences about childhood trauma recovery and the importance of community support in healing processes. Detective Patel had been promoted and was now leading a regional task force focused on hate crimes and false reporting patterns. The story's impact extended far beyond Maplewood itself. The cell phone footage of Ahmad being handcuffed had become required viewing in police training programs focused on implicit bias and community relations. The case had influenced federal guidelines for responding to reports involving refugee families, emphasizing the need for cultural competency and measured responses that consider the potential for racially motivated false reporting. On the second anniversary of the incident, Ahmad, now 10 years old, and serving as a student ambassador for Maplewood Elementary's diversity programs, wrote a letter that was published in the school newspaper and picked up by national media. The letter, written in his careful fourth-grade handwriting, captured both his personal growth and his community's evolution. 2 years ago, someone called the police because they were afraid of me. They saw me burying my school project and thought I was doing something dangerous because of how I look and where my family comes from. It was the scariest day of my life. But it also showed me how many good people there are in America who will stand up for kids like me. My playground is different now. It has new swings and a garden with flowers that bloom in different colors. Just like the kids who play here come from different places, but all belong in America. I still remember being scared, but I also remember learning that home isn't just a place where people look like you. It's a place where people care about you and want you to feel safe. Maplewood is my home now, and I'm proud to be an American kid who also remembers Syria. Both parts of my story matter, and both parts make our community stronger. The letter was accompanied by a photograph of Ahmad standing in the Friendship Garden beside the oak tree, his arms around two classmates, Maria, whose family had emigrated from Guatemala, and David, whose great-grandparents had fled persecution in Poland. The three children were laughing at something outside the camera's frame, their joy a testament to childhood's remarkable capacity for resilience and forgiveness. As seasons changed and time passed, the oak tree grew taller and stronger, its roots extending deeper into Maplewood soil. Beneath its branches, the time capsules waited patiently to tell future generations about a community that had faced its worst impulses and chosen to become better. The playground's laughter returned, richer and more diverse than before, carrying the voices of children who understood that their differences were not dangers to be feared, but treasures to be celebrated. The Maplewood incident had begun with a single phone call rooted in fear and prejudice. It ended with a community transformed, having learned that true security comes not from excluding those who seem different, but from building bridges strong enough to support everyone's dreams. In the end, Ahmad's time capsule had achieved its intended purpose. After all, it had taught future generations about the journey from fear to understanding, from division to unity, from hatred to hope. The oak tree stands today as a living monument to that journey, its branches reaching toward a sky that belongs equally to all children, regardless of the countries their families once called home. Underneath its canopy, the future of America plays and learns and grows, rooted in soil enriched by the stories of every child who has ever dared to plant their dreams in foreign ground and call it home.